how it feels to play the Callisto Protocol. This has been how it feels to play the Callisto Protocol. It was only 2 videos ago where I mentioned my lack of expectations for modern gaming. I rarely buy into hype. I go into most newer titles hoping for, but not expecting the best. A tact that I think has served me pretty well in recent years. But even with that general low-bar presumption of quality, I can still be surprised by a game from time to time. Though, in the case of the Callisto Protocol, what surprised me was how much I didn't like it. I never expected to have such negative feelings toward Callisto Protocol. It was a new IP that a lot of us were actively hoping would succeed. A spiritual successor to Dead Space, a big middle finger to Electronic Arts, who killed that beloved series attempting to chase trends, only to dig up the corpse years later for a remake. These guys were gonna show that evil corporation how it's done. Except they didn't. Callisto Protocol fails as a horror game, as an action game. There are elements handled so incompetently that it's hard to imagine some of the same people making this also made something as great as Dead Space. And I know some of you will take issue with the two being compared to one another, and yes, mechanically both titles are very different, but they're both in the sci-fi space horror genre, they were both worked on by some of the same devs, and most importantly, Callisto does practically everything worse than a game that came out 14 years ago, and I think that's worth pointing out. I'll start with the story, which won't take long because there's not much story to go over. I'd be shocked if even this game's most loyal defenders were able to care about anything that happened in it. You play as Jacob, a contractor transporting cargo to Black Iron Prison located on the moon Callisto, when hostiles board his ship, causing it to crash. While Jacob survives the incident, he's quickly captured, processed, and shoved in a cell for unknown reasons, only for some kind of outbreak to occur shortly after, giving him a chance to escape. The plot that follows this is very simple, relying on dumb, familiar tropes that play out exactly how you think they're going to. Space zombies in space prison, that's all you need to know. Audio logs you find laying around don't flesh out things in a meaningful way, mostly boiling down to, oh no, I'm about to die. And the characters and their relationships with one another are surface level. They're not interesting or compelling in any way, making it impossible to give a single shit about them. To their credit, the recognizable cast are doing what they can. They're fine with how little they have to work with, though I must point out the injustice that is wasting Sam Witwer, who some of you may recognize from Days Gone. His character is this cartoonishly evil sociopath on a power trip, and it's clear early on that Witwer is having a blast performing such an over-the-top role. But he maybe has 5 minutes of total screen time over the 10-hour campaign. He's so absent from what's happening, you'll probably forget he was ever there to begin with, and as far as I'm concerned, that's a crime. I'll also mention that the plot leaves things unfinished with a blatant sequel bait that it does not earn. Though I'm not sure if it's teasing an actual second game or that story DLC they're selling in the Season Pass. I hope it's not the latter, cause that would mean they're charging extra for the game's real conclusion. Something to keep an eye on. In hindsight, it should have been a red flag that all the marketing for Callisto, at least what I saw anyway, revolved entirely around the graphical presentation. Oh man, look at how sick our death animations are. Look how realistic this dude's face is. Yeah, okay, great. The Order 1886 looked really nice too. Looks don't make a game. But given how much the technology was pushed, I'll concede that this game is impressive visually speaking, for the most part. There are some really cool areas to admire, and characters look phenomenal with detailed facial capture, but the problem with putting so much focus on the presentation is that anything not up to par jumps out. Stuff like the bad-looking fire, the occasional animation bugging out, getting stuck on nothing in the tutorial, blood splatter appearing inside of your enclosed suit, the surprising lack of environmental interaction, a character blinking out of existence for a scripted moment, mostly nitpicky stuff, sure, but stuff that's noticeable. Oh, and PSA for anyone playing this on PS5. Before you do anything, go into the audio options and set the radio chatter selection to TV. For the first 30 minutes of my playthrough, I legit thought Callisto's audio was bugged, because for some reason, all of that dialogue is defaulted to come through the controller speakers, and I have that function turned off.
Max, we got trouble. We've been boarded. Yeah, I'm guessing.
This isn't the Wii, don't do that. As for those death animations that were heavily touted, for as much as they were talked about, they honestly aren't all that special. There was one I remember being brutal enough to make me go, damn! But if you've played any violent video games before, the rest are pretty standard. The biggest things about the death scenes that I noticed is the lack of effort to naturally transition to them. When your health drops to 0, Jacob will either awkwardly slump to the floor like a drunk uncle, or be jarringly yanked into a gory pre-canned animation. It feels very artificial. These kills also repeat themselves a lot, tend to go on for a while, and are unskippable, quickly making them tedious to sit through. You don't fear the Reaper because of the disturbing end your character goes through, you fear him because he likes to waste your time. Future Craig here. Since I procrastinated this review so much, a patch has since been released that made the death scenes skippable, and they were really banking on people loving these things. Some other things I bring up later may have been tweaked in some way, but that's not what I played. I'm critiquing what originally came out and what a lot of people experienced, just mentioning that update now before the comments do. Now back to the original video. Performance has been a big sticking point for the game's launch, especially on PC. Some of the clips I've seen of that version are shocking, but on PS5, things generally ran fine. Framerate was a bit sloppy, and there were some areas of slowdown, but nothing that got in the way, though I did experience 2 crashes that resulted in lost progress. I'm sure patches will iron stuff out, or have, depending on when I get this review done, but releasing in a state that even the most powerful computers couldn't handle is plain unacceptable, especially for a title that clearly prioritizes its looks over its gameplay. I don't say that last sentence lightly, but it's the only conclusion I can draw when the gameplay here is as it is. Despite all the other comparisons we can make between Callisto and Dead Space, the 2 games do not play the same at all. One of them is actually fun. Dead Space at its core was a third-person shooter, essentially Resident Evil 4 with aliens, and it was a formula that worked well. While Callisto does have guns in it, there's a very limited selection, tight inventory space makes ammo hoarding difficult, and they all lack the power you'd expect, so while you can lean on them every once in a while, more so in the game's second half, shooting is not the focus. Firearms are more meant to be used as a complement to the real gameplay loop, melee combat. Much to my surprise, Callisto Protocol is actually mostly a brawler. The majority of encounters are resolved by bashing enemies over the head with an astoundingly sturdy stun baton. This is admittedly an interesting choice, and definitely differentiates Callisto from its peers, but being unique doesn't automatically translate to quality. Now, I can recognize clunky aspects of a game's systems and still come away with positive vibes. I've proven as much talking about other things on this channel, but when every part of your core gameplay is as poorly put together as Callisto's, my patience wears thin remarkably fast. The melee combat is very stiff, and no matter how many upgrades you eventually get, that feeling persists. Battling a space zombie pulls you into a soft lock-on where you spam a button to swing your electro stick while dodging or blocking their attacks in turn. It's going for an up-close cinematic duel thing, but this Rock'em Sock'em routine lacks real depth. You'll see the same attack animations over and over against the same small pool of enemy types, and most fights overstay their welcome because of how spongy these mutated bastards are. At its best, this design leads to boring, predictable encounters that feel too long for their own good, but at its worst, it made me want to pull my hair out, in large part due to a crappy dodge system. While the abominations you face can take a beating, Jacob is relatively fragile. Just a handful of hits will put him down, especially in the first half when he doesn't have that snazzy suit featured in all the promotional art. Healing requires a drawn-out injection animation, stopping you from simply spamming heals to tank your way through tough fights, so when you see an attack coming, you'll want to get out of the way. In order to dodge, all you have to do is hold down your movement stick left or right while an enemy is coming at you. You are explicitly told there's no timing window to worry about. You don't even have to pay attention to the angle of an opponent's swing. Just hold left or right when an enemy strikes, and Jacob will automatically dodge the blow. If you're dealing with a flurry of attacks, you do have to alternate directions to continue avoiding them, so if a dude swings 4 times and your first dodge was left, you'll have to go left, right to avoid all 4. Make sense? You can also hold back to block incoming attacks, but you'll still take a bit of damage doing that, so it's more practical to fully avoid hits. Having this necessary life-saving input be the same as basic movement is inherently clunky, and can lead to moments where you just want to reorient yourself but end up getting locked into a dodge instead. You'll also learn the hard way that animation canceling is not a thing. If you start an attack and realize you're about to trade damage, there's nothing you can do. You're stuck. Every part of your brain will scream at you to get out of the way. You'll hold the stick in a direction, hoping in vain that maybe Jacob's self-preservation instinct will kick in, but it's all for nothing. You're getting hit. This is not only frustrating, but slows down encounters, making them less dynamic, more robotic. Wait for an enemy to attack, dodge, counter, wait again. It's a rigid system that can't possibly carry an entire game. But what's worse is that sometimes dodging just doesn't fucking work. Since all you're doing is holding a direction, you're essentially hoping that the game plays itself correctly, but there were absolutely instances where my inputs didn't register. You'll see a hit coming, hold the stick well in advance, but Jacob will ignore you and take it on the chin. But what's even more egregious are times where an attack was coming, I held the stick, the dodge animation clearly started to play, but halfway through the game went, oops, we decided that hit, sorry. It didn't happen all the time, but it wasn't a one-off fluke either. If you're going to make a vital aspect of your combat system more or less automatic, then it has to work 100%. Anything less than that is infuriatingly unreliable. So I don't find this melee system to be very engaging, but when everything does work as it should, it's passable for one-on-one encounters. The way you're locked onto a single enemy, the close-up nature of the camera, clearly this combat was built around dealing with one plague-ridden threat at a time, so of course the game constantly throws groups at you. When you have to battle 2, 3, 4, 5 enemies at once, the fighting falls apart. It does not work. The closed-in camera makes it impossible to see off-screen threats. There are no indicators to help you keep track of them. You can't dodge what you're not looking at. You'll be wailing on one guy about to finish him off, only for the auto-lock to wildly shift to someone else. And if you think maybe you can run past some of these annoying hordes, nope, they'll chase you down and knock you on your ass. It is some incredibly messy encounter design. Sure, taking on only one guy at a time would quickly get boring. But then don't design your combat this way! One element I haven't mentioned yet is the grip module, basically the kinesis power from Dead Space, which seems to be included as a band-aid to dealing with large groups. You can use it to pick up enemies and throw them, a pretty lame throw that feels more like a playground shove, but it is useful for tossing hostiles into hazards like wall spikes or spinning grinders for instant kills. In fact, these environmental kills became sort of a crutch whenever they were available, if for no other reason than they let me get fights over with faster. There are certain arena-like sections that would be absolutely miserable without them. But outside of cheesing some encounters, this power isn't utilized at all. It's not every day you have a game that sees telekinesis as an afterthought, but here you go. There's also stealth, but it's the really basic crouch and backstab kind we've all seen before, and outside of one extended section filled with blind enemies, you'll never use it, so it's not worth harping on. I've spent most of my time here on Callisto's combat, because it's the backbone of the experience. It's the only real way you have to interact with the world, and it was the biggest source of frustration as I played. but I'll quickly touch on a few other things that weren't great either. I would describe this game's level design as oppressively linear. Now, linearity is not a bad thing. These days I strongly prefer it over bloated 60-hour open worlds. Hell, the first two Dead Space games were entirely linear, but they gave you room to explore. Callisto pretty much has you going in a straight line through cramped corridors. I rolled my eyes at the sheer number of vents you have to spend 30 seconds climbing through, or watching Jacob slowly squeeze through a gap. If the game does ever branch off in two directions, one will continue the critical path, while the other leads to some small side room, and you usually won't know which is which, making it possible to accidentally lock yourself out of unexplored zones. But even then, the most you'll find down that detour will be a chest of items you probably won't be able to pick up because of the inventory restrictions, which negates the entire reward. While good linearity is a guiding hand that you can be tricked into not noticing, in Callisto you can practically feel the tracks under your feet at all times. The poor checkpoints also don't help. They have a terrible habit of happening right before scripted dialogue or a store, so when you get your face smashed in because the dodge didn't work right, you'll have to sit through that unskippable conversation again, or have to rebuy all the upgrades you wanted, each of which comes with its own animation. Some will argue that these crappy checkpoints are a deliberate punishment that amplifies tension, but no. Inconvenience isn't tense, it's tiresome, especially when that so-called punishment is the result of bad controls and encounter design. And a final note for those wondering, the Callisto Protocol is in no way scary. To be fair, I've never actually found Dead Space all that scary either, but Callisto totally falls flat. There's kind of an inherent issue with the decision to heavily focus on brawling, as it requires you to get right up in everything's face. It's hard to be frightened of creatures you're barreling up to and bonking senseless. But aside from that, Callisto's idea of horror is jump scares. It's the sole crutch the game relies on. A handful of them admittedly got a jolt out of me. When so many are thrown at you, odds are a few will do their job, but most were easily predictable duds. But even if every single one of them did work, constantly screaming in the player's face isn't really horror, it's lame. The worst kind of cheap scare the game does repeatedly are essentially booby traps. First, there are these face tentacle guys that suddenly grab you from across the room. You can kill them before they lunge and avoid the QTE that follows, but they show up so sporadically that you'll never expect them. They're also incredibly hard to pick out from the background, and are usually placed out of sight around corners, so by the time you hear their sound cue, it's already too late. More obnoxious than that, though, are these fucking worms. You'll deal with them during normal play, and they're easy to kill, but every so often, you'll open some locker or chest looking for items, only for one to leap out and start munching. There is nothing indicating which containers are traps, no way for you to predict these bullshit attacks. You just have to take the hit, and since you naturally want resources, you're going to open every chest. This kind of thing would work if it happened exactly once. Like 2/3 through the game, when you're fully comfortable opening stuff, you find one and bam, now you're paranoid for the rest of the game. But instead, Callisto pulls this stunt like a dozen times. No joke, there was a 20-minute stretch in the last few hours where I found 4 chests in a row with a worm hiding in them. Like, you think that's enough? Jump scares can be an effective tool, but not when they're leaned on this hard, and not when they come at the expense of the player. So, yeah, I'm not a fan of the Callisto Protocol. It's not fun to play, the story is nothing, it's lacking in spooks, and like a vain high school diva, relies entirely on its looks for attention. With the clear focus on visual details, the player seems like an inconvenience, someone the game is begrudgingly giving control to, hoping they don't get in the way too much, which is kind of a problem when the media in question is meant to be interactive. I said on social media that I believe Saints Row 2022 is a better game than the Callisto Protocol, a statement some took as hyperbolic or me being overdramatic, but I stand by that. Look, the latest Saints Row sucks. It ruins a beloved franchise, but we all knew that was going to happen, and playing it tended to ride an unenjoyable flat line of mediocrity the whole way through. But many of us expected much more out of Callisto given the pedigree, and while it also rides that same unfun flatline for most of its runtime, it also has periods where it plummets into severe aggravation, not because of bugs or technical problems, but because of bad core design choices. I know some people are tired of the comparison, but Dead Space is still great all these years later, and when you've had over a decade to create a spiritual follow-up, delivering the equivalent of "we have Dead Space at home" just isn't good enough. Hey, thanks for watching. Please help me out in the algorithm by leaving a like, a comment, a dislike if you want. If you're still in a survival horror mood, then go check out my review of Zombie U and subscribe to the channel for more content in the future.